The skin is its own system. It's called the integumentary system. And so the skin is our cutaneous membrane. It's our only dry membrane. And it is made up of epithelial tissue, which is in the epidermis, and that is stratified squamous epithelium. And of course, it is keratinized. The epithelial tissue lays on top of connective tissue. And that is the dermis. And that connective tissue is going to be mainly dense, irregular connective tissue with a little areolar at the top as well. So the skin, or the epidermis, if we start there, the epidermis, I try to draw it here. Has layers to it, okay? So the bottom of the epidermis is here. So under it, starting there, all that is dermis. So the epidermis is stuck to the connective tissue below it. So the cells, there are cells here. And they're right on top, these cells that are right on top of the connective tissue look like a lot like cuboidal cells. They're kind of bigger, fatter cells. And these cells make up, these one layer of cells make up a whole layer, and that's called the stratum Papillae. And these cells are very mitotic. So they divide. So they sit on top of this areolar connective tissue. They have their basement membrane is here, and it's attached to that connective tissue of the dermis. And the cells here are called keratinocytes, most of them. I can spell. Keratinocytes. And they're simple it's stratified squamous epithelium, so they're squamous cells, but they're called keratinocytes. There are cells cells within the basal layer here, the Stratum Papillae. And these cells are called melanocytes. So these keratinocytes here in the basal layer divide, and one of those cells will stay on the basal layer, and the other cell will start to move up. And they move up So they move up into this layer, and this layer here is called the Stratum Spinosum. And in the Stratum Spinosum, these cells are, kind of growing and they're starting to mature, and they start to fill with keratin. Okay, these are keratinocytes, and over the course of moving up, they're going to get more and more full of keratin. Keratin is a protein. It's the protein that makes our skin hard. Okay, and hard meaning just protective. All right, we have actually two types of keratin: a hard keratin, which is actually for nails and hair, and then a softer keratin that is for your skin. So the cells go through, their growing thing, and they start to become filled with keratin. Then they move up into the next layer, and this layer is called the Stratum Granulosum. And the Stratum Granulosum is where these cells they're starting to fill with keratin, and it's starting to form these like granules of keratin, and they sort of start to secrete little lipids. Okay. The next, and just so you know, as these cells are going up, they're dying. Okay. Right here in the granulosum, the organelles are starting to deteriorate and all of that. These are dying cells. Okay, so the next layer here is a very small layer, and this layer that I'm putting in here only exists in thick skin. This is called the Stratum lucidum. And they're still sort of barfing out lipids, and they're getting all keratinized. Their organelles are basically dead. So these guys are pretty much on the outs. They're almost dead. But this particular stratum is only in thick skin. So that's your palms and the soles of your feet. Okay. So in the other skin, that layer, it does not occur, is not there. So that sort of the dying part of it is still occurring in the granulosum. So the last layer is the Stratum Corneum. So this is called the Stratum Corneum. And it's the largest layer. It's the layer that you see on the histology slides that look really weirdly colored. Okay, they're dead cells. So these are dead cells, and they're starting to look like bricks in a wall. Right? Well, they do look like bricks in a wall. They start to do that in the granulosum. They start to take this appearance. And these bricks are full of keratin, and the outside of the bricks is some sort of like a mortar, and that's the glycolipids. And together, those two things pretty much make the skin waterproof. Okay, so the Stratum Granulosum. So this whole thing is the epidermis. Again, it's stratified squamous epithelia, so it is not vascular. So down here under it is the dermis, all the way down. So the dermis. And there are two layers of the dermis. So the first layer, let's do it like this. The first layer here is loose connective tissue, and it's areolar connective tissue. And that's called the papillary layer. And again, that's areolar connective tissue, which makes sense because it's feeding the basal layer of the epidermis. In there, you're going to see capillary beds up in here. These are what we call dermal papillae, and they're these little finger-like projections that that punch up towards or into the epidermis there. So there are capillary beds there, and there are also neurons, or receptors here. So the receptors are called Meissner's corpuscles. There are receptors in the basal layer as well, right next to the dermis, and those are called Merkel's discs, or Merkel cells. And those Merkel cells are touch receptors. Meissner's corpuscles are touch receptors. Okay. Under the papillary layer is what's called the reticular layer. And the reticular layer is just dense, irregular connective tissue. So dense, irregular connective tissue. All right, so those are the layers of the skin, the epidermis and the dermis. There things that are in the dermis. There are some touch receptors. There's the something called the Pacinian corpuscle, which is a big looking receptor that looks like a lollipop kind of. It's also a big touch receptor. There's going to be a follicle in here, which I'm not showing here. There's blood, of course, blood vessels in here, and nerves and all of that. Okay. There's also glands. Okay. So like here's a sweat gland. And then there are also oil glands, but those are part of the follicle, and I'm just not artistic enough to draw that. So make sure you go through the components of the skin. That's how the layers work. Remember, those are the layers. They're the different layer. The stratum are the layers for the epidermis, and the papillary and reticular layer are the layers of the dermis. And remember, epidermis, stratified squamous epithelia, dermis, connective tissue.